Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Elon Musk, the CEO of electric car maker Tesla, officially took over Twitter in a $44 billion deal. Musk, who first agreed to take over the platform in April, says he will bolster, quote, free speech on Twitter, including pledges to restore the accounts of previously banned users. He even floated the idea to turn Twitter into a super app, much like popular Chinese app WeChat. On the latest development regarding Twitter and more, let's turn to our panelists. For the Twitter takeover, in New York, Max Wolf, CEO of Systematic Ventures, and in Shanghai, Shen Yi, director from the Fudan University's Research Center for Cyberspace Governance. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, Mr. Wolf, what do you make of this takeover? After a while, quite drama, it's done.
Well, I think it's a fitting irony that it seems that the takeover of Twitter might have been a mistake that began on Twitter of a boast of a gentleman who likes to boast and has the extreme amount of money to back those boasts up. So it's the purchase of Twitter is a cautionary tale about Twitter, but it opens a new era of one of the sort of major first drafts of news around the world.
What kind of new era? Would you like to illustrate more?
Yeah, like I think you have a very well-resourced individual who has no relevant experience and who seems to be putting kind of loyalists into place in an industry that provides a very vital service, but has proved fairly poor at making a profit doing that service provision.
Very interesting. Mr. Wolf, do you see that's a regulation issue? Do you see that's a business corporate responsibility issue, ESG issue? What exactly is it? Who is responsible for that?
Yeah, so I do think that the business case issue at Twitter and the regulatory issue are actually the same issue. So the problem that the firm has historically is that the only revenue it draws is from advertising, and advertisers won't pay against toxic or unknown content. In other words, a global brand is not going to advertise products when it might be sitting next to hate speech or wild conspiracy theories, because the association is something you'd be willing to pay for only if it's at least neutral or better yet positive, right? Also, the analytics engines in Twitter are fairly poor compared to Facebook or TikTok or the competitors. So I think the analytics engines need to be upgraded. And I also think they need a content moderation. And a little bit concerned to me is the idea that it's a free speech platform. Free speech platform is a public good, right? It's a politically controversial public good that loses money and exists until it angers the state so much that it's shut down. It's a terrible business model, right? So I think you have to kind of figure out whether you have a business model that's viable here or not. If you do, it's actually going to mean smarter and more uniform content moderation, not less content moderation.
Isn't that the topic for decades about any media company? I mean, any media company that are supposed to win public trust, whether it is in this part of the world or the others, Mr. Shen.
Yes, but the Twitter is quite different because the ICT technologies, cross-border users, make the users become into the billionaires levels. We need to consider these things more seriously and quite different comparing to the traditional media.
Mr. Wolf.
Yeah, I think the model of the future looks more like what the former Twitter founder is trying to do at Blue Sky, which is these more decentralized things. So I think for Twitter to be successful, it has to do something that everyone else can't do cheaper, faster, better, and newer, which means it has to come up with a profitable way to moderate content and recognize and bifurcate its public and private existence. And it hasn't done that yet.
We've seen from a video, jokingly, Mr. Musk was talking about comparing the future of Twitter to the current stage of WeChat. Now, Mr. Wolf, of course, Mr. Musk has seen having advertising in mind. He's very good with these kind of public promotion strategy. However, how would you compare the pear and the oranges?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Look, I think the model that Twitter has been talking about trying to do for a long time is borrowing from the Chinese internet model. If they don't want to be beholden to advertising, they're going to have to figure out an e-commerce integration, which has been very nicely done by the dominant platforms in China and has not much been successful here. There are flirtations from a little bit from Instagram and a few other places here, but we haven't really figured out social commerce in the US. If Twitter were able to do that, they would be very profitable. Again, though, only with content moderation and as a private company, because nobody wants sort of fringe, politically charged speech next to selling a pair of slippers or a t-shirt. That model I don't think works anywhere.
Even though some business models, for example, of certain media companies are exactly like that, hate speech besides the selling slipper advertisement, and it works well, for example, with some kinds of TV stations and their other platforms, Mr. Wolf.
Sure, but there has to be a niche. So that's not going to be a large, right? So that can be a niche audience of sort of people who want wild or dangerous speech, but you're not going to do that with a billion users, right? That's not going to be the model.
Mr. Shen, on the comparing the pears and the oranges.
Generally speaking, these two things cannot be comparing in either ways because, for example, we have Twitter first, and then we have the WeChat. And actually, WeChat coming or grows from a completely different business model and business logic. In China, we have this QQ first, and the WeChat actually heavily depend on the ecosystem produced by or shaped by the QQ and its ecosystems.
What exactly is this ecosystem you're talking about?
I think this ecosystem is a strong trust relationship networks. Actually, WeChat is not a public platforms for information. It's quite highly personalized platforms. It allow people to chat with the people it's know in a very close relationship or group. At least they sharing one point of views or some same interest. But on Twitter side, it's quite different logic. So it will be difficult to comparing these two things.
Mr. Wolf.
Yeah, look, I think that there's an irreconcilability of the broadcast model versus the engagement model. Twitter is vital because Twitter is mostly the first draft of history, and it's followed a lot by journalists who endlessly talk about Twitter, probably more than its real natural importance, because it's so important to the field of journalism in the US historically and around the West. So it has this extra weight. I think that people need to trust their platform at least a little bit, and they need to trust the engagement they have with people on that platform. And that doesn't work with the free speech model. The free speech model is just a good political rallying cry for Elon Musk to pretend that a private business transaction is about some sort of deep moral or philosophical commitment. It's a sort of thin advertising veneer, as far as I can tell.
On the other hand, Mr. Wolf, there's a lot of comparison between Facebook and Twitter on both their track records, their business models, and their international appeal. Your thoughts on that? What does this specifically take over by Mr. Musk might mean in that comparison?
So it's a great question. And ironically, I covered the IPOs of both Twitter and Facebook. And I said way back then, 10 years ago, basically, and I'd say again now, they're fundamentally different companies. They just became big social media companies around the same time. They have some overlap of investors and they went public at around the same time. The business model is completely different. And Facebook was designed to collect the data on its users and transmit that to advertisers to allow targeted advertising. Twitter never figured out those analytics, and it had less of a walled garden approach. So the content control wasn't so much there. It's not meant for that. And so it was a much more open architecture with much less insight into the users. So it is, again, more of a public good historically, and it hasn't made the jump to those analytics even 10 years later. So it still has relatively harder user interface problems than Facebook, which is pretty universally easy to get on. And it doesn't have much insight into the users to sell to advertisers. So it really has to figure out what it wants to be when it grows up, even though it's a teenager now.
Final question also for you, Mr. Shen. Diplomatically put, the governance styles of the cyberspace in the US and in China very different. How do you see, the observations of the story of Twitter and its current owner likely to provide some kinds of inspirations and space for insights for this part of the world?
I think that the government styles and models is quite different in United States and China, but there have some overlapping of key interest. For example, the national security. For example, such kind of any information platforms are not allowed to challenge the domestic political procedures and so on. If possible, I wish that Elon Musk's takeover of these Twitters were providing a good beginner, new starters in this time of ages when people already find out and understanding such kind of hate speech, fake news, or the conspiracy theories will be do damage to both the security and the stabilities, then we should proper time starting to find the new models of regulations and operation models for such kind of platforms.
Interesting. I'm sure those are up for debates for years to come. Thank you so much, Shen Yi, Max Wolf. Appreciate it.
Thank you.